Well, good afternoon. You'd think that'd be hard for a preacher to learn to say good afternoon. You're used to saying good morning or good evening, right? That's actually really easy for me. We go to a congregation that meets at the highly unorthodox and borderline heretical time of 2 o'clock in the afternoon every Sunday. So it took me a long time to get used to saying good afternoon, but I've got it down now. So this works out really well for me to be here this time of day. It's kind of what I'm used to. But that's perhaps a different story for a different day. It's good to be with you yet again as we continue our discussion of why we can trust the gospel narratives, particularly in the face of skepticism that says we shouldn't trust the gospel narratives. We talked yesterday about the question of whether it was passed down to us accurately over a couple of millennia, which is a fair question to ask, especially when you know some of the facts that the skeptics will raise that turn out really not to be as big of an objection as it might sound like they are. Well, today we're going to talk about a second objection that gets raised, and that is that the Gospels are contradictory to one another. There are contradictions in the Gospel stories. Matthew will say one thing. You good? All right. So the question of whether the Gospels are in contradiction with one another is what we're looking at today, where Matthew will say one thing, Mark will say something else, or Luke will say something, and John will say something else. And what do we do with these places where the Gospels look like they're in contradiction? And I don't know if you've asked this question or you've thought about this or it's even registered for you to you before, but there certainly are places where at least superficially it looks like there might be a contradiction. Let me share with you a couple of quotes from skeptics that come up along the way. This is from a fellow named Christopher Hitchens, who you may have heard of before. He is one of the new atheists, as they were called when they first came out. They've begun to lose some traction. Richard Dawkins is kind of the headliner of this group. That's a name that just about everybody's heard of. Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens were the four horsemen they like to call themselves, gems of fellows. But this is from his book, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. And he says the New Testament that's what he's talking about. He says it or something literally. But the New Testament is a work of crude carpentry, hammered together long after its purported events and full of improvised attempts to make everything come out right. That's his understanding of the New Testament. It's not historical. It's certainly not historical from eyewitnesses. We'll talk about that tomorrow, why we have really, really good reason to believe it is based on eyewitness testimony. But, and you've got all these people telling all these different stories, and you kind of jam it all together, and you hope it all works out right. I mentioned Bart Ehrman yesterday, a very skeptical New Testament scholar, brilliant man, probably knows more about the Bible than I do, but is just as skeptical as you can be. The next two quotes are pulled from something that he will give in debates. He's a big debater on circuits. You can find all sorts of stuff of him on YouTube if you care to waste your time. No, it is interesting to know the kinds of things they say. And I don't know if he's published this in writing as well, probably so somewhere. But this is a quote that he has used in multiple different debates that I've seen, some variation of this. The first one I just want to stand on its own, but it's the lead into the longer one that follows. And that is, okay. See, this is how you create suspense. The sources, and he's talking about Jesus' resurrection specifically in this context, the sources are hopelessly contradictory. And the reason I want this one to stand on its own is because of the words that I've italicized in this quote. I want you to remember these words. Because we're not talking about something from the skeptical perspective that it looks like it might be in conflict, but if you look at it and think about it hard enough, it's really not in conflict after all. He is talking about things that are, he says, hopelessly contradictory. There is no way whatsoever that you can reconcile these different accounts of the same thing. And so remember that, and what I want you to keep asking yourself over and over and over today, not is, does this look superficially contradictory? Or is this hard to figure out, but there might be an answer? Or do I not know exactly what the solution is, but I can come up with 3 or 4 plausible solutions? But is this hopelessly contradictory? Because for something to be a contradiction, it must actually be that. In a second, we're going to flesh out the difference between real and apparent contradictions, because they're not the same thing. And an apparent contradiction is not hopelessly contradictory. A real contradiction is. That's what he says these things are. This is from the debate. This is as he begins to flesh this out a little bit more. There are small discrepancies between the Gospels, hundreds of them. The Gospel of John says explicitly that Jesus died on the day of preparation for the Passover, the afternoon before the Passover meal was eaten. The Gospel of Mark says explicitly that Jesus died the morning after the Passover meal was eaten. Don't take my word for it. Read John 19 and Mark 15 for yourself. They contradict each other. Or look at the resurrection accounts in the four Gospels sometime and ask yourself, how many women went to the tomb? What were their names? Was the stone rolled away before the women arrived or after they got there? What did they see there? One man, two men, or two angels? What were they told to do? To tell the disciples to go to Galilee or not? Did they tell the disciples or not? Did the Gospels go to Galilee or not? It depends on which Gospel you read. You get a different story every time. Now, we're going to talk about some of those specifically later on. So don't let this worry you. There is something to the point that he's making, which is, it is true that one Gospel says they saw one man, and one Gospel says they saw two men, and one Gospel says they saw one angel, and one Gospel says they saw two angels. And when you look at that, it is true. Those four Gospels literally say four different things. Does that mean they're in contradiction with one another? That's what we're going to be thinking about today, those kinds of things. And we'll look at some of these examples specifically. We'll look at least one that's not from Ehrman's list as well. But these are the kinds of questions we're talking about when we talk about contradictions within the Gospels and whether there are contradictions. But the first thing I want to do is, for a moment, set the Bible aside. And we'll come back to the Bible. We'll come back to these things later on. Remember I said last night that one of the things the skeptics like to say is we need to treat the Bible like we treat every other book. And what they mean by that is it's not inspired. You can't believe it's inspired. You can't believe it came from God. You've got to treat it like a secular document. To which I said, okay, let's do that and see how it fares. And what we saw last night is in terms of manuscripts and those sorts of things, it so far supersedes and blows away everything else that is not biblical, that it's not even really a conversation. Well, as we think about that sort of criteria, how do you judge a regular book? What do you do with contradictions in regular history? I think there's something to be gained from that because it is informative. How do you deal with this sort of thing? What are the implications of these kinds of things? Well, first of all, let's talk about the difference between actual contradictions and apparent contradictions. A real contradiction is when you have two things side by side where one of them must be false if the other one is true. There's no way around it. It is an actual real contradiction. They both cannot be true in the same way at the same time. That's contradiction. However, there are things that look contradictory that are not necessarily contradictory. Let me give you a quick example. I want to make sure it's not something I'll talk about later. No, that is something I'm going to talk about later, so I'm not going to use that one. There is an example that I'm not going to talk about today about Jesus casting out the demons on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And there are two different place locations given for where that happens in different Gospels. And there are various ways of reconciling that. This is one where we don't know for sure what the answer is. But one of the solutions is that the name of the city that is given is really not the name of that city, or it's a kind of a borrowed name of that city from another city that is ruling the entire region. And the bottom line then is ultimately one is a city name, the other is the region's name. It'd be like saying, this event happened in Fayetteville or this event happened in Tennessee. Well, those are in contradiction with one another. Well, only if you don't know that Fayetteville's in Tennessee. If you know that, you shrug your shoulders and you move on because it's obviously not, it looks like it could be in contradiction, but it's not in contradiction. So that's an apparent contradiction, something that looks contradictory, but isn't necessarily so. It looks contradictory. It looks like they both can't be true, but they can, in fact, both be true once you have more information about what's going on. Well, how do these apparent contradictions happen? How does it look like there's a contradiction? What is it that makes skeptics say there's a contradiction when there really isn't one? Well, let me give you a short list, and there's going to be there's going to be a bunch of words on the slide here in a second. And if you're taking notes from the slide, it's probably not a good idea to try to write this down. But I'll leave the PowerPoint here. You can get it from someone else later if you want this information. but just to save you from hand cramps, I'll mention that. So here are what I'm calling some common causes of apparent contradictions. Things that lead to us saying, oh, that's a contradiction when it's not necessarily one. Starting with carelessness, we'll call it, and this is all for alliterative purposes. We can come up with different words for this, but they're all going to start with C, except apparent. Carelessness is when you interpret a phrase or sentence without regard to the context. The context of the narrative itself, without regard to the genre of something. So if you're reading, for example, something from the book of Revelation, that is an apocalyptic document. You don't read apocalypse the same way you read history. For the same reason you don't read autobiography the same way you read fairy tale. I mean, it would be wrong to pick up Cinderella and read it like you would read a biography of Abraham Lincoln. That you're not, it's ridiculous is what it is. You're going to lead yourself to all kinds of understanding problems if you try to do that. So you have to know something about the genre. You have to know something about the narrative context. We talked last night about what Mark is doing in his gospel and why he abbreviates the confession of Peter. Well, that's in contradiction with Matthew's, isn't it? Because he doesn't say the same thing. No, Mark is doing something in the context of his narrative, and that's why he does it that way. And if you ignore that context, then you're going to think there's a problem. But if you understand the context, you'll say, okay, something different is happening here. And so if you carelessly ignore context, it's going to make you think there's a contradiction where there isn't one. Something we'll call completeness. And this is a major problem the skeptics have. And I can't wrap my mind around why they don't see this, but it is assuming that every account of an event includes every detail of it. How many women went to the tomb? We'll talk about this in more detail later on. One says there was one woman. One says there were a couple of women. One says there's a whole bunch of women. Are those in contradiction? Well, yes, if everyone says there was one woman and only one woman. One says there were two women and only two women, and so forth. But you don't have to tell everything there is about something to be telling the truth about it. You don't have to record every single detail to be recording a factual account of something. And it is only when you impose this false criteria that every narrative is telling you everything there is to say about that event that you are going to have a contradiction based on this problem. The next two go together, conflation and confusion, where you either treat two different people as the same. So you have two different Judases, for example, or two different Simons, and you think it's the same guy when it's not really. Or you treat one person as two different people. You think, oh, my mind just went totally blank on that. Well, you can figure that out. It's the opposite of what I just said a second ago. So conflation and confusion, they go hand in hand. It's you get mixed up in the details of whether one is two or one, and you got all these different people with the same names. We'll talk about that actually on Sunday evening, the different names in the Gospels and what that tells us about the Gospel records. And then cultural context is another context one, but this is outside of genre and narrative. It is what's going on in the first century Greco-Roman world and not being aware of that and presuming that the facts and language or the facts about the language and culture of those things are identical to now. And this is patently absurd, yet it happens all the time. Well, they couldn't have possibly done something like that. Oh, really? They couldn't have? I mean, you could say that about 50 years ago in America and look at it and say, well, no one could have possibly done that. Yeah, they could have, and they did. And so, again, as you come to know more about the cultural context, that solves a lot of these problems as well. There's a great example that's not exactly cultural. I guess it maybe could fit into cultural context. It's a story in the Gospels. I think it's in Mark. Yeah, it's in Mark, where Jesus is up in Phoenicia, Tyre and Sidon, that region. And he's going from there to the Decapolis, the 10 cities on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. And he's in Sidon, I believe. Sidon's the one that's further south, right? Does anyone know geography better than me? Tyre's north and Sidon's south, I think, of those two cities. And he's in Sidon, and he's in Sidon, and he's going to the Decapolis. And Mark says he went from Sidon to Tyre to the Decapolis. And there is a highly regarded, very educated commentary on the Gospel of Mark that says that Mark, this was obviously not by someone who knew the geography of the land, because he went the wrong way. It'd be like saying you're going from Fayetteville, Tennessee to Tampa, and you went to Nashville to go to Tampa. But that doesn't make sense. No one would possibly do that. The problem with that is that directly between Sidon and the Decapolis is a big mountain. And if you go north a little ways, there's a mountain pass, and a road. And so everybody went north to go south when you went that route. But if you don't know the geography, you look at a map and you say, this guy didn't know the geography. But who is actually the one who's in error here? The person that didn't know the cultural context, didn't know the geographical context. And it's not the guy that was writing 2,000 years ago. It's the guy sitting in his ivory tower now thinking he knows everything about 2,000 years ago. And so those kinds of things come up as well. And again, this happens all over the place. And this is the sort of thing that happens with any history. This is not a Bible-specific problem. This is a historical problem. Because anytime you have multiple accounts of the same event, you're going to have at least apparent contradictions, if not actual contradictions. Let me show you how this works. Any of you know Ray Bradbury, science fiction author? Any of you read any of this stuff? Yeah? At least heard his name maybe. Well, he died a few years back. And I'm going to share with you 3 actual real-life media quotes about his death. First of all, legendary science fiction author Ray Bradbury passed away Wednesday morning in Los Angeles. Secondly, Bradbury's daughter confirmed his death to the Associated Press on Wednesday morning. She said that her father died Tuesday night in Southern California. Third, Bradbury died Tuesday night in Los Angeles. His agent, Michael Congdon, confirmed. Now, if I were Bart Ehrman, and this were the Bible, I would say these 3 accounts are hopelessly contradictory. And the reason I would say that is because one of these accounts tells us that he died on Wednesday, and another one tells us he died on Tuesday. One of them says that he died in Southern California, and the other says he died in Los Angeles. And then on top of that, one says his daughter confirmed his death, and another says his agent confirmed his death. There are 3 contradictions in these 3 different quotes about his death that are all very significant in terms of key information about what these quotes are saying. They are hopelessly contradictory with each other. Or are they? So let's do a little audience participation here. How do we reconcile these 3 quotes? There's one that's really, really easy. You know what that one is, right? Yeah, Los Angeles, Southern California, it's the same thing. One's regional, one's more specific. Broad, generic versus specific is the solution there. And this is easy for us to solve because we live in this cultural geographical context. We know this. If this is 2,000 years later in a different cultural context, it doesn't know American geography the way that we do, you might see how they could struggle with that. And again, that as soon as you begin to realize that, maybe you look at the Bible in a different way and say, well, maybe there's a solution to this that I just don't see because I'm not in that cultural geographical context. So that's the easy one. What about the day of his death or the person confirming it? Yeah, more than one person can confirm something. This is the problem of completeness is what this is. If one of them said his daughter and only his daughter confirmed his death, and the other said his agent and only his agent confirmed his death, then you've got a contradiction. But one could even say his daughter and only his daughter confirmed his death, and another one could say, and then the next day his agent also confirmed his death, and then they're still not in contradiction because of timeline and someone coming on and saying something else later on. So even that sort of exclusive statement on one can be changed with a new historical reality being added to the equation. So yeah, different people can confirm the death differently. All right, what about the time of the death? Wednesday morning, Tuesday night, Tuesday night. Yeah. Okay, so one solution is we talk about the same period of time 2 different ways. If he died Wednesday morning at 2 a.m., people can either literally say Wednesday morning, or they can colloquially say Tuesday night. And unless you're just one of those people that no one really likes, you're not going to raise an issue about that. Now, if you're one of those people, I'm sorry. Actually, you should be the one apologizing to the rest of us. But People aren't sticklers about that unless they're just being annoying for the fun of being annoying. But we talk about the same period of time two different ways. So maybe that's the solution. I'll tell you, I don't know what the solution is to this, but that's one possible solution. Any other possible solutions? How about this one? One of them's wrong. It's entirely possible that one of these is wrong. It may be that he died Tuesday night, and actually two of them are wrong. It was, let's see, what am I looking for here? He died Tuesday night. He confirmed it Wednesday morning, and then the other one got the things crossed up, and in the process, his death turned from Tuesday night to Wednesday morning. One of them is just wrong. Now, the reason I bring that up as a possibility is because what does that mean about the truth of the story if the time of his death is wrong in the report? Does that mean that Ray Bradbury didn't die? Does that mean that Ray Bradbury never existed? You see, something to think about here when you've stepped aside from the Bible for a moment. I think we're all invested in biblical accuracy. We're all invested in biblical inspiration. Most of us are probably invested in biblical inerrancy as well. I imagine just about all of us are invested in that as well. But when you set that aside for a second, let's talk about how history works. All of these things could become, maybe we couldn't solve any of them. Maybe all three of those things we just talked about are actual contradictions in these accounts. But you know what? Ray Bradbury is still dead at the end of the day. And the fact that they're in contradiction with one another does not change the fact that Ray Bradbury is dead, and they all accurately reported that key part of the story. And so that's something else to think about along the lines. And I don't think we're going to wind up in a spot in any of these cases where we say, well, it looks like the Bible is in contradiction with itself. That's not where I land on any of this. But even if it did, look at that little detail that you're talking about in this apparent contradiction and say, does it change the truth of the key fact that is being reported? And it never does. And so even if there are a couple of little mistakes, which again, I'm not saying there are, just to be clear, but even if there are, the truth of the account is still there. And so I think that becomes an important thing as well. Let me give you one other example of this from history. When the Declaration of Independence, when it was written and publicly proclaimed for the first time a couple weeks after it being written, it was publicly proclaimed. That's harder to say than I realized. Publicly proclaimed from the balcony of the old State House in Boston on July 18th, 1776. There are a couple of different reports of how it happened. In particular, who it was that spoke the Declaration. Some say that it was William Greenleaf, who was the High Sheriff of Suffolk County, that did the proclaiming of the Declaration of Independence. And some say that it was Colonel Thomas Crafts who publicly proclaimed the Declaration of Independence. So you've got, and they're all talking about the same event at the same time. This is one I give to my students sometimes and say, what do you do with that? And one of the very first things I hear quite frequently is, well, maybe it was two different readings at two different times of the day, which is a clever thing to suggest, and that makes really good sense as a plausible solution, but unfortunately that's not what the solution is here. They are talking about the same event, the same reading, the same time of day. And so how do you reconcile these things? Well, again, one thing that I would say about that is that even if they are hopelessly contradictory to one another, it was still read on that day. And the truth of that event does not change because we didn't know who did it. In reality, there is a solution to this. Does anyone happen to know offhand what was going on in this account? Anyone want to take a stab at it? I don't want to make anyone guess if you're not comfortable with it. Well, what actually happened in this event on that day is Greenleaf started to do it as kind of the official dignitary, the High Sheriff of Suffolk County. He's the one that is in this position to do this thing. But it turns out that he had a very weak voice, and so to speak, the people in the back couldn't hear him. And it became obvious that the person who's supposed to be doing this reading couldn't get the message out to everybody. And so Colonel Crafts stepped in with his more booming voice and became the personal PA system of Mr. Greenleaf. And it was a lot like a translation. If I'm preaching at a Spanish congregation and there's a translator and I talk a little bit, then he talks a little bit, and it goes back and forth. They did that, except it was the same language, and that guy could talk louder, and so everyone could hear it. And so that's what happened. They both actually read the Declaration of Independence, or one read and the other echoed in a louder voice. And so the point of all of this is to say you can look at different historical accounts of different things and find things that look like they're contradictory. You can find things that look like they're hopelessly contradictory. And yet there are plausible solutions. There are real solutions in a lot of cases. There's one more example I'm not going to use. I don't have the details with me. But I love the example because the person who put this together was doing it specifically with the Gospels in mind. And it's an account of International Junior Hockey League Championship or something like that, where he went through multiple different reports of it and found different quotations. And what he does is he writes the entire article as if it is, a biblical scholar talking about the Bible and saying it's in contradiction here, it's in contradiction. He talks about the double tradition and the triple tradition, which is how people talk about, Matthew, Mark, and Luke is the triple tradition if all three of those Gospels refer to it. And he just goes through it, and it's so well done. And it makes this point so obviously that, you know what? Every day we read multiple news reports of the same thing where there are apparent contradictions, and we don't even raise our eyebrows about it once, because we can easily figure out the contradiction, or we may not even notice the contradiction, or we realize that, hey, maybe one of them is wrong, but the truth of the story is all still there in the midst of all of this. And so that's what I think is really important from this kind of step outside the Bible perspective and look at this from a historical perspective, is to see how this whole there are hopeless contradictions thing actually works itself out when you're dealing with history. Now take that idea and bring it back to the Bible. And, what do you do then? Well, again, you look through it, you look more closely at it. You say, are there cultural things? Are there narrative things? Is there information that I'm missing? Am I presuming too much about this? Those are the kinds of questions that we need to ask. And again, even if there are minor differences, they don't affect the overall picture of the story unless those contradictions are so extensive that they're actually undermining the narrative itself. If you've got one that says Ray Bradbury died and another that says Ray Bradbury didn't die, now you've got a contradiction that messes with the actual event itself. But if they are these peripheral sorts of layers of information rather than those that are at the heart of what is being reported, they don't affect what's being reported anyway. And yet these are the kinds of things, all of those contradictions about the resurrection. How many people were there? Was the stone rolled away or wasn't it? You notice how none of those little details are even remotely related to whether Jesus is actually still in the tomb. So even if every single one of those things was wrong, and I'm not saying that they are, but even if every single one of those things was wrong, the narrative, what the narrative is about, is still untouched. And we look at that all the time in history outside the Bible, and we understand that. So if we take that idea and bring it back to the Bible, that by itself should give you more confidence in the basic trustworthiness of the narrative. But then once you start looking at some of these alleged contradictions and start thinking about them, I think it becomes even more obvious that this isn't something we need to worry about. So what we're going to do with the rest of our time today is work our way through a handful here. I've got four specific alleged contradictions to talk about in some more detail. Now, obviously, 4 does not exhaust the list. These are representative sorts of contradictions. They're the kinds of things that you will find people raise issues about. 3 of them are going to be from the Bart Ehrman quote. Since I brought that up, I figured I should at least solve some of them for you, rather than give you something to shake your faith and say, oh, have fun with that, guys. We'll talk about 3 of those, and then one other that is very commonly raised as well. So if you want to turn in your Bibles with me, we'll actually be reading a little bit of the Bible today. I know we didn't do that yesterday, but we'll be looking at some of these. Turn with me in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 8 is where we'll begin here with the story of the centurion who comes to Jesus looking for a miracle. Matthew chapter 8 and verse 5. When he had entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly, and so forth and so on. The story goes. That's all we need for our purposes today. Sorry, I didn't tell you it was going to be a long reading or a spiritually moving reading. I just said we were reading. So the centurion comes to Jesus and says, can you come heal my servant? He's paralyzed at home. Now, flip over to Luke chapter 7, and you get Luke's account of this same event. Luke chapter 7, beginning in verse 1, after he had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. Now a centurion had a servant who was sick and at the point of death, who was highly valued by him. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent to him elders of the Jews, asking him to come and heal his servant. You see the difference there, right? Matthew says the centurion came to Jesus and asked him to heal his servant. Luke says the centurion heard about Jesus and told some of the elders of the Jews to go to Jesus to ask him to heal his servant. So Matthew says the centurion did it. Luke says the centurion sent someone else to Jesus to ask him to do it. Now, you can see how, at least superficially, that is a contradiction. So, what would be your response to a skeptic who tells you the Bible is in conflict here? Any thoughts? Yeah, Brian.
It was by his authority that he was asking Jesus to heal his servant.
Okay.
It's the same verse.
Okay, so it was by his authority. He sent them by his authority, so it's the same thing as him doing it. Now, you hear that a lot. Is that a fair solution to this problem? To say that if someone does it by someone else's authority, it's the same thing as that person doing it. You think that's stretching, or do you think that's fair? I think it's fair. Why do you think that's fair? Agency, yeah, the idea of...
You don't have to lift the hammer, work yourself.
Okay. You hire it done and you say, we built this house, even though you never picked up the hammer yourself. How many times have you seen on the news, the president said such and such today? When you know good and well that a speechwriter wrote it and his press secretary said it. The president never spoke a word. But do you say, no, the president didn't say that? I mean, even, I shouldn't go there. I was going to say even the left-wing media wouldn't do that, but we don't want to get political, so I won't say that. I mean, we understand that's how this works. So the idea that the centurion, by his authority, had a delegation sent, it is the same thing as if he said it himself. Let me give you another example of this. And this is a fantastic example of this because it is in the exact same context. 2 verses later, actually, I'll just pick up in the next verse to get the full sentence. The elders come to Jesus saying, he is worthy to have you do this for him. So that what they're doing at the outset is they're saying, they're trying to grease the wheels. They're trying to say, yeah, Jesus, you really should do this for this guy. And here's why you should do this for him. Because he loves our nation, and he is the one who built us our synagogue. Now, what are the odds, to use our example here, the centurion's out there hammering away on the synagogue? I mean, it's got to be pretty close to 0. That guy has too much authority and too much prominence and too much else to do to be out there doing manual labor building a synagogue. Maybe, I don't know, maybe he cut the ribbon if there was an ancient ribbon cutting ceremony. And maybe he shoveled the first shovel of ceremonial dirt if they did that. But other than that, he was the authority that got it done. He was the financier that got it done. He had some significant role in getting it done, but he wasn't out there building that synagogue. And even if he did do some of the work himself, he wasn't doing it alone, which is what this says. It says he did it. Not he and some other laborers. He did. Well, no, that's ridiculous. Because we understand how language works. And that's a big part of the problem when you're dealing with this sort of thing. People who actually understand how language works pretend like they don't understand how language works. I built a house. Really? You did? All the labor, all by yourself? Oh, no, of course not. No one hears that sentence that way. He built a synagogue, all by, no, of course, we understand. He asked them versus he sent someone to ask him, oh, we've got this terrible contradiction. Well, it's patently absurd. Once you understand the way that this sort of thing actually works. The same thing with Joseph of Arimathea giving his tomb for the body of Jesus. And Matthew tells us that Joseph had dug out this tomb. Really wealthy, aristocratic Sanhedrin council member Joseph is out there digging a tomb. No, he is not. He paid some slave to dig a tomb. Or he made a slave dig a tomb. He paid a laborer, whatever it was. It wasn't him out there digging it. Yet again, we know exactly how this sort of thing works. Well, moving on from that example, because I'll soapbox about that for too long. How many women were at the tomb? This one actually gets us to all four of the Gospels. So let's take a look at this very quickly. Matthew chapter 28. Matthew chapter 28 and verse 1. Now after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. So you've got two women named Mary who go to see the tomb. One of them is specified as Mary Magdalene. The other is the other, which is not very helpful considering there are like 10 of them in the Gospels. But Mary Magdalene and the other Mary are the ones who go see the tomb. Mark chapter 16 and verse 1. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. So now we've gone from 2 to 3. Presumably it's the same two Marys, but Matthew was so imprecise on the second one. But I think it's safe. I think even most skeptics would presume it's safe to say that they're the same two Marys. But now we've got a third person. Luke chapter 24. Luke chapter 24 and verse 10. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. And so the name comes later. We're told in verse 1 it was they who went to the tomb. Well, who are the they? The they are specified when you get down to verse 10. So you've got two Marys again, but Salome's gone. She's replaced by Joanna and this other group of women, whoever they are, the others. And so now we've gone from 2 to 3 to at least 4 or 5. I mean, it sounds like there's at least 2 more. So at least 5 is what we're at here with Luke. Finally, then in John chapter 20 and verse 1. Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. We're down to 1 all of a sudden. From 2 to 3 to at least 5 to 1. And so you could see why someone like a Bart Ehrman would say, how many women went to the tomb? It's a different number every time. But are these hopelessly contradictory? Let me suggest to you, for the sake of time, I'll skip asking you on this one, because this one's, I think, a little bit easier. They're only hopelessly contradictory if each account says this woman and only this woman, or these women and only these women. And in fact, 2 of the accounts tell us that there are more than just those on the list. Luke does it explicitly. Luke says, and the other women. So Salome is presumably in that group of the other women. She's named in Mark, but she's not named in Matthew. She's not named in Luke, but presumably she's part of that other group. You only have a contradiction if they are explicitly limiting it to the people who are named in that group. Now, John also tells us it's more than just Mary Magdalene. Now, John does it implicitly in something that Mary herself says. But you have to pay careful attention to pick it up. So as you continue reading on here in John, as you get to verse 2, the very next verse, so she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. Did Mary Magdalene turn into a British aristocrat that speaks in the first person plural? You know, is this the royal we of Great Britain? Well, no, she's talking about herself and the other people that were with her. So why doesn't John mention all of the other people? Well, John is doing something specific in the narrative context. You've got 2 problems here. One, the problem of completeness, where you presume that the list is exhaustive. And secondly, the problem of carelessness, where you're reading something without regard to its narrative context. Because what is happening in John 20, in the very next scene, but you have the specific focus on Jesus' encounter with Mary Magdalene. Why do you think maybe that John highlights Mary among the other apostles instead of the group of the women, or why just her instead of some of the others, or why not? Well, because he's focusing on her in this story. So he mentions her as the one who is there. He lets her acknowledge there are more of them who was there in the use of the word we, and then gets to the story about her, which is what he's driving at anyway here. And so when you understand that the account's not necessarily exhaustive, you understand what John is doing in his context, then it's really not a big problem at all. The next one is the angels at the tomb here. In this same basic story, and we're not going to read every one of these. I'm just going to tell you what they say. You can check me out on your own if you'd like to. Again, I mentioned earlier, Barterman's actually incomplete on this one. He says 1 man, 2 men, or 2 angels, I think is what he says. There's actually 4 different options here. Matthew says 1 angel, Mark says 1 young man, Luke says 2 men, John says 2 angels. So was it 1 man, 1 angel, 2 men, or 2 angels? Are they hopelessly contradictory with each other? I'll open this one back up. What do you think? Again, you've got the problem of completeness, right? Only if it says 1 and only 1, or 2 and only 2. But men and angels aren't the same thing. So how do you solve that problem? Yeah, Kevin?
People, the angels look, they can take the form of a human-ish person.
Yeah, I like to, I don't think I put this on, I'm quite certain I didn't put it on here. No, I didn't. Because I never know how it'll go in different places. I've got this very elaborate picture of this glowing angel with giant wings and a halo and all of that that I like to show. And I say, this is not what an angel looks like. At least not in most biblical stories. One day, Abraham was sitting outside of his house, and God and a couple of angels showed up. And he didn't know who it was. One day, Lot was sitting at the gate of Sodom, and a couple of angels showed up. And he didn't know who it was. And the author of Hebrews, probably thinking about those 2 accounts, said it's possible to entertain angels unaware. Now, how do you suppose that happens? Oh man, I didn't see your wings there. How did I miss that? You know, I just thought that was a funny glow coming from you for some reason. I thought you were doing something different with your hair. I didn't realize it was a halo. I mean, it's absurd to think that you can mistake an angel for a person unless the angel has, for whatever reason, decided to look like a person. Now, what they actually look like in their spiritual existence, I don't even want to presume to pretend to know it all. That's above my pay grade, and I'm not terribly interested in it. And most of the time, angels show up, people are terrified anyway. So these cartoonish cherub things you see, that's not real either. But they can at least look like people. And so, you know, maybe one is focusing on the one angel rather than naming them both because one of them talks in a couple of the accounts. Let's say that I was at the store one day and I ran into an old buddy of mine from college who's from a different town. And I ran into him, and around the corner walks this woman, and he goes, "Oh, hey, this is my wife. I wanted to introduce you to her. I had never met her before." And so we talked for a while. And then we separate, go our separate ways. And then later I get home and I tell my wife, "Hey, I saw Mike today." Would I be lying to her because I didn't say I saw Mike and his new wife that you've never met either? Or am I just highlighting the person that is significant to both of us or significant for the story? Maybe later I fill that in, maybe I don't. But there's a reason why someone might name only one of 2 people if it's significant to the story, like Mary Magdalene in John. Or like one of the angels, when he is the one who is speaking, he might be highlighted over the others. And that's the easy solution. We're not grasping at straws here. This is common sense is what this is. The difference between men and angels, maybe one or 2, I should say, 2 of the Gospels are reporting what they saw. They saw people that looked like men. And maybe the other 2 Gospels are interpreting what they saw. They might have looked like men, but in fact they were angels. One is being more exhaustive to say two. One is being more specific to say one. John's the most interesting one of all, and this is kind of like our brief Mark discussion last night. We're taking a little bit of a John to the side, but John's the interesting one because John is the one that tells us there were two angels, and John is the one that says one is at the head and one is at the foot of the place that Jesus lay. Now you stop for a second and imagine this big, flat, raised platform where the body would have been with an angel on either side of it, and what does that image immediately make you think of? That's the Ark of the Covenant. And what is in the middle of the Ark of the Covenant is the mercy seat sprinkled with the blood of the sacrifice. What is John doing here? I mean, John is trying to make you think of atonement is what he's doing in describing it that way. So what is the narrative context? Again, once you start to see what's going on here, it becomes, this isn't hopelessly contradictory. These different authors doing different things for their purposes. And again, what if they are wrong? What if it was two men and they weren't angels at all, and some of them said one and only one, and some of them said angels and not men? The tomb's still empty in every single account. And so the fundamental truth of it still hasn't changed at all. Well, the last one we'll talk about, and I probably should have saved more time for this because this is a bit more complex than some of the others. Again, this is what Bart Ehrman says. I'll read his quote precisely here. He says, the Gospel of John says explicitly that Jesus died on the day of preparation for Passover, the afternoon before the Passover meal was eaten. The Gospel of Mark says explicitly that Jesus died the morning after the Passover meal was eaten. So what is going on here? Well, let's look at these very quickly. I'm in John right now, so I'll look at that one first. John chapter 19 and verse 14. John says this, now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. So preparation of the Passover sounds like they're getting the Passover ready, is what that sounds like. Back in Mark chapter 14, and verse 12, on the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, where will you have us go and prepare for you to eat the Passover? And so they go on and they prepare the Passover, and then they are eating the Passover in verse 22 when he, institutes the Lord's Supper and all of those things go on. And so what's going on? Well, a common way of solving this that people have come up with, and this is a plausible solution. I don't think it's the right one myself, but a plausible solution is Jesus knows he's about to die, and so they have the Passover early. That's a plausible solution to that problem. Have any of you ever been traveling on Christmas Day, and so you let your kids open their presents a day or two early? Obviously, that kind of thing happens all the time. Does that mean you don't know when Christmas was? No, there's a reason why. So the idea that Jesus could have taken the Passover meal early because of what's going on in his life, that's plausible. Now, I don't think that's the solution, and here's why. If you look at the very next chapter of Mark, and again, it's fascinating that we find the answer to this in the same place. It's kind of like the Luke example of the centurion building the synagogue. You get the answer in this idea of agency there. Well, you get the answer here in Mark as well. Mark chapter 15 and verse 42. When evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath. What is the day of preparation? The day before the Sabbath. Now, why might the day of Friday, the day before the Sabbath, why might that have come to be called the day of preparation? You can't work on the Sabbath, right? So you got to do some preparation. I mean, the old law talks about that specifically, right? On Friday, you need to gather up twice as much manna so that you don't go out and gather on the Sabbath day, or you'll be struck dead, So you've got to prepare. And this becomes a very fascinating thing because in the Greek language, the word for Friday is the word preparation. It seems that this Jewish custom had so significantly impacted the culture around them that the Greek language was impacted by this. The Greek word for Friday is the word preparation. So what does preparation of the Passover mean? Does it mean the day they were preparing for the Passover, which it could mean that, or does it mean Friday of Passover week? You know how sometimes you'll hear in our culture, Easter Sunday? This was Passover Friday. Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, book 15, talks about the Jews not being obliged to go before any judge on Sabbath day, nor on preparation for it. Or as it's translated by a lot of translations of Josephus, the Friday before it. So outside the Bible, preparation is used to talk about Friday. In the Didache, another ancient second century document, your fast should not be with the hypocrites, for they fast on Mondays and Thursdays. You should fast on Wednesdays and preparations. In context, obviously, Fridays. The martyrdom of Polycarp. So taking the lad with them on preparation about the supper hour, the horsemen went forth with their accustomed arm and so forth and so on. Preparation, again, is their Friday. That's the day. The word preparation can either mean to prepare for something, or it can just mean Friday. Those are your two options. And it is context that determines which of those things that it means. And there is no evidence of the word preparation being associated specifically with any other day whatsoever. And so what is John saying in this context? When John says it was the preparation of the Passover, that's the question. Is he saying he was preparing for the Passover, or is it just Friday of Passover week and that's all that means? In which case it is perfectly in alignment with what the rest of the Gospels say, which is that he died on Friday of Passover week. Now here's the thing about this. Not only is that a plausible solution, that's a really good, historically attested, outside the Bible solution. It's a linguistically sound solution. It matches the language of the authors. Here's the problem with it. Bart Ehrman could run circles around me in Greek. There is no way on earth he does not know everything I just told you. There was a debate that was going on in the first 2 centuries between Augustine and Faustus, I believe is who it was he was debating. And in one of his responses, Augustine said something to the effect of, I don't have the exact quote, but he said, there is no way that he is so ignorant that he does not know this. He is pretending to be ignorant to deceive those who are. One of the things about Bart Ehrman is that he writes in very different styles depending on who he's writing for. Bart Ehrman writes popular level books for the masses that become New York Times bestsellers. And Bart Ehrman writes academic books for academicians who are in his field that know what he's talking about. One of those categories that he writes is far more moderate and level-headed, and one is as extreme as can be. Can you guess maybe which one's which? He's pretending to be ignorant to deceive the masses, or somehow something has slipped past him that I can't even begin to fathom how it did. So just because someone with multiple credentials after their name says something doesn't mean that it's so. He has an agenda. He's someone who grew up in a very, very fundamental sort of group and ultimately rejected it. And what happens when you are on one far side of something and you reject that is not that you go back to a nice middle point. That's never what happens. You swing way to the other side. The pendulum swings back and forth hard. And he is not just skeptical of Christianity. He will never tell you this, but it is obvious in the things that he says and does. He is against Christianity. He wants for your faith to falter, and that's why he says the things that he says. He would never lump himself in with a Richard Dawkins, who is openly anti-Christian, but he's doing it on a different level, and he's doing the exact same thing. So that would be my warning about him and people like him. You can make it something that sounds like a compelling argument against Christianity, and you can make it really easily. We talked about this last night. And like I said, this goes multiple different directions. You could do the same thing with atheism. You could do the same thing with Bart Ehrman and walk in and throw a lob a bomb in on his view in 30 seconds, and it's a perfectly good view that he has, and he has to take 30 minutes to unravel the nonsense you spewed. But that's the problem here is, it takes 40, 50 minutes to really think through these kinds of issues. And in terms of specifics, we only looked at 4. But this is what I'll leave you with as we wrap up this discussion today. When you think in terms of how history works, there are always apparent contradictions that you have to reconcile. That's the norm. That is the standard reality, is that there are apparent contradictions and you have to reconcile them and you have to harmonize them. That is reality when you're dealing with history. So that's the norm, first of all. Secondly, just because something looks like a contradiction doesn't mean that it is a contradiction. There are all sorts of reasons why things might look like contradictions that aren't. Third, as long as you can come up with plausible solutions, you don't have a contradiction. Now, it might be contradictory, but it's not necessarily a contradiction if in 30 seconds you can come up with 4 plausible solutions. That's not a contradiction. It may be a difficulty. Fourth, just because you're not certain that you know which of those solutions is the right one, doesn't mean that the whole thing is wrong. We may never know exactly what the answer to some of these apparent contradictions are. But again, if I can come up with 3 or 4 solutions off the top of my head that aren't stretching, then there's certainly no reason to throw it out as unreliable. And then finally, remember that even if something is contradictory in the peripheral details, if the heart of the story is told in every single one, then the heart of the story is still there all the way down the line. So as people say the Bible's in contradiction, don't let that shake your faith. I saw a list, and I didn't bring this with me either. It's some 490 alleged biblical contradictions. And there's some gigantic chart that is worthless except for to amaze you at how big the chart is. But what you find on that list are things that are absurd. Answer a fool according to his folly. Don't answer a fool according to his folly. A biblical contradiction. Yeah, right. If you don't know how wisdom literature works, yeah, that's a contradiction. Those 2 verses are back to back. Either the guy that wrote Proverbs is the biggest idiot who ever lived and didn't realize that he was contradicting himself in back-to-back sentences, or maybe he put them side by side to make a point. Some of them are absurd, some of them are more difficult, but all of them you can find plausible solutions to. None of them tear down the story itself. So don't let these sorts of things affect your faith or impact you or shake you from the gospel. Remember that this is how reality works. This is how history works. You always have to try to find solutions because when you have eyewitness accounts, there are always going to be different perspectives in how they're told. Well, let me wrap up with something kind of stepping aside for a moment as we did last night. And I want to share with you a story. Kayvon, you're going to know this because I was preaching in Americus, Georgia a few weeks ago, and I told this story there. So I don't think the rest of you will know this unless you've heard me tell it in some other context. But this is a story that comes from my father's childhood. And it's meaningful to me to think about because I think it helps me understand the difficulties of life and their real significance. And it's a great year to be thinking about the difficulties of life, isn't it? This is a year for the books, I tell you. We've had one thing after another, and we haven't even gotten to the election yet. It just keeps getting worse. And November still has to roll around. So when you stop and you think about it, what are these difficulties? Well, the reason I think about this is because, again, the story means so much to me. My father grew up in the far northwest corner of Arkansas, and he was born in the 1940s, which by the 1940s, you had some pretty, technology's moving pretty well along by the 1940s. 1940s, they're flying airplanes and driving around in tanks and stuff in the world wars. This is not, 1800s, except in northwest Arkansas, where it still was the 1800s. My father was born in his home, not in a hospital, a home that did not have indoor plumbing at that point. In the 1940s, did not have indoor plumbing. So, this is the level of technological advancement they had achieved up there at that point, and it was a very impoverished area of the country as well. To give you an idea of the impoverishment, my grandfather would celebrate special occasions by taking his wife and son and two daughters or one daughter, depending on what, how far along they were in their family, to the corner store to buy them all a grape knee high. That was the grand celebration of a special event, is a little bottle of carbonated grape beverage. Well, those occasions were special to them because they didn't know anything other than that. And my father would collect the bottle caps from those trips to the store. He had this growing bottle cap collection that he kept in a box, and like kids do, carried it around everywhere with him. But one day he was walking through the house and he tripped, and the bottle caps went flying out of his hand and hit in just the spot that they all went right down the register that let the heat up from the furnace. And it was basically gone. I mean, they didn't go into the furnace and burn up, but they were down there out of reach. He couldn't get them. And he was inconsolable because he lost his bottle caps. And it was to the point that my grandfather, who was not even remotely emotionally driven, but pragmatism takes over when your child won't stop crying, that he took the whole thing apart so he'd get the bottle caps back out for him. Now, you might think that this is a bit absurd to be that broken up over bottle caps. Or maybe you're a sentimentalist and you say, no, I get it. But even if you are sentimental, they're still just bottle caps. I mean, this is not the end of the world. They're just bottle caps. And that's what my dad thinks too now. He looks back at this and he remembers it. And he knows how kids' minds work. And he understands sentimentalism. So he understands why it would. But they're just bottle caps is all they are. And on top of that, the only reason he even knows the story is because he heard his parents repeat it so many times. You have that story in your life? You know the story backward and forward, but not because you remember it, but because you heard your parents tell it? We all have that story in our lives. That's one of his. Now, why do I tell this in relation to suffering? Well, this was a great emotional trauma for him. But now he looks at it and says, one, it was silly for me to be that emotionally broken up about this, given their actual value. It was kind of silly. And two, I don't even actually remember it. Something that was at once the most traumatic moment of my life, I don't even remember it. Well, what does that have to do with anything that we're talking about in relation to the Bible and Christianity? Sometimes we get the mistaken notion, at least I believe it's a mistaken notion, that one day we'll understand everything there is to understand, or we can ask about everything there is to ask, or we'll know why we went through the things that we went through. In fact, sometimes we sing, farther along we'll know all about it, farther along we'll understand why. I don't know that the Bible ever promises us that, though. And you think about some of the suffering that people of God did and what their declaration of faith was. Job says, I know that my Redeemer lives. And he doesn't say, and at the last, I will understand why I suffered the way I suffered. He says, and at the last, I will see God. Paul doesn't say the present sufferings are not worth being compared to the understanding that I'm going to have when God explains everything to me. He says the present sufferings aren't worth being compared to the glory that will be revealed. You know, there's something comforting about thinking that maybe one day we'll understand why we suffered the way that we suffered. But what's more comforting than that is realizing that just maybe the worst thing we ever experienced in this life will be nothing but a collection of bottle caps that we think is silly to be so worked up about, and we might not even remember it anyway. Because when we see God, we won't even care about it anymore. That, I think, is the promise we have in the Bible. That the glory that awaits us turns everything that we suffered in this life into a whole bunch of nothing. But that's the promise that is for God's people. The promise for those who reject God is not so kind. And while you certainly don't want to try to scare someone into an understanding of come to God, the reality is that there is motivation in the fear that we have. And so as we turn to this period of time where we traditionally offer an invitation for anyone who wants to make their life right with the Lord, think about those promises. Think about the promises of glory, the promises of comfort, and the promises of doom. And let that help shape the decision that you make. And if there's some way that we can help you in a public way today, let that be known as we stand and sing.